Can natural disasters cause conflict? Let's see. The short answer is yes and no. Similar to other issues we've covered so far in the last several months in this class, from population pressures to population movement and migration, to water scarcity, food production and food scarcity, to natural resource extraction, a lot of fundamental environmental or climate related structural characteristics of the world in which we live in can shape the likelihood of there being widespread political violence. We focus on civil conflict in this class because it's the most common and most destructive form of conflict in the world today since the end of the Cold War. However, as we've seen in the class, there's often other less seen impacts of structural challenges to how people live and how governments respond to them. And in this class, we've seen a multi-step process by which these background conditions like natural disasters, natural resource abundance in developing countries aren't necessarily themselves likely to lead directly to conflict. It's how they're channeled through government's abilities to respond in weak states that might not have the capacity to respond to self-interest, corruption, or incentives to use violence to get what you want, as well as providing motivations either through grievances or through greed to try to seize the resources or to try to change power in order to change policy. And this week is the last example of a high-profile kind of background exogenous event that some people have connected to the outbreak of conflict through their research. Okay, but let's start with the more optimistic take on what disasters' effects on political stability can have. And they can actually decrease the risk of conflict for a couple of different reasons. The readings talked about that more today. Through a rally around the flag effect, there's nothing like a natural disaster to potentially bring people together, realize their common humanity, and to try to support the government as they respond to this challenge in the names of everyone within the state. It could actually reduce the capacity of groups to start conflicts because of the impasse. If roads are not passable, if people are more worried about their own survival or their family's survival, they don't have that kind of freedom to go be able to fight for ideals or longer term economic interests if they're just worried about survival. Natural disasters could paradoxically lead to the killing of popular rebel leaders that could lead to an opportunity for the ending of conflict, because as we've seen, we haven't really seen that much in this class, but there really is a literature on rebel leaders, how important they are to organize conflict, and how longer term they could potentially be sticking points in actually moving beyond a conflict period into a post-conflict period. Contrast this with ways in which disasters can increase the risk of conflict, and you can focus more on the effects, as I did a bit less in the previous slide, in state and rebel-focused effects of how disasters can increase conflict. State-focused, the natural or man-made disasters can reduce state capacity to prevent rebellion. Usually with quick, sudden disasters, like with the Pakistani floods, the military or the National Guard, Coast Guard, other kinds of government, often armed groups are deployed to be able to provide assistance to people in need as well as resources, and that takes helicopters and people away from potentially being able to repress rebel groups, and so the states are preoccupied, don't have the money or resources to be able to prevent people from acting out. Other more rebel-focused explanations for why disasters could increase conflict risk: states could just do a bad job. We saw in the Pakistani example that people were already feeling dissatisfied with the government's response to the flooding. So the state could respond poorly. That could lead to grievances against the state. People who have lost parents, orphans, are often easier to recruit. They have lower opportunity costs and potentially not that kind of support network to prevent people from taking that kind of risky chance. Citizens can also face chance of greater relative deprivation, which could make it more dissatisfied. We saw with the motivations literature several months ago in this class how there's arguments for absolute deprivation and relative deprivation. Absolute deprivation actually can decrease the chance that people have the ability to fight their government if they're just fighting for survival. You actually have that kind of non-linear relationship in which you need to have some resources or some ability to be able to have the time and energy to fight. And so relative deprivation would show that you're not doing as well as potentially other people in your country, either at the through vertical or horizontal inequality, which we've already touched on so far in this class. Through like droughts with the Miguel et al. Article that we saw, 7 weeks ago now. So how can disasters connect to other causes that we've touched on so far in this class? Migration would definitely be a clear one in which disasters often provoke mass migrations. During the 2010 Pakistani floods, the video that I had before the second video, over 1 million people were displaced, most of them internally within the country. And there's often a non-linear relationship, similar with the grievance in the previous slide between wealth and migration, that it does take some resources to be able to migrate to another part of the country or to another country altogether. In New Orleans, that we moved several years after Hurricane Katrina, often it was people that were forced to stay because they didn't have the resources or the health ability to be able to move, that they didn't migrate before the disaster and weren't able to migrate in the aftermath as well. So the poorest and the richest are the least likely to move, but the poor because they don't have the resources to, the richest because they have the capacity to be able to mitigate or to adapt to changing circumstances. And so, you need those social, cultural, or economic resources to be able to move away from where the disasters are hit. Another element that kind of plays into my own research, right? ANU is about research-led teaching. I have a paper focused on disasters and the military responses. Once I get done with this term, I'll be able to get back to it. But as I mentioned before, in the Pakistani case, as well as in how disasters might increase the risk of conflict, is through military deployment. Often domestic militaries and international militaries respond to natural disasters. I mentioned the Pakistani flooding in 2010, the Haiti earthquake also that happened in the same year, led to the assistance and involvement by over 20 countries' military or government actors, and they came as far as China and Qatar. So when there is natural disasters, kind of like with the fires in 2020 here in Canberra, you had firefighters coming from Europe, they're coming from Canada, coming from the US to help. As a way, it's kind of a group mutual assistance society, that there are set patterns and agreements between different countries to be able to deploy military assets to be able to respond to these kind of disasters. Interestingly, with the Pakistan disaster, Pakistan has been resistant to admitting some countries' militaries after their disasters because of worries of autonomy, or through the military's not just there to help provide for assistance, but potentially getting information. Allowing other foreign militaries into the country can be a quite sensitive decision, as well as when countries decide to send their resources to different countries can often be a political decision. This is the first time I mentioned the P word, but politics is at the heart of a lot of the responses to disasters, both at an individual level and a state level. And for my research, I looked at how the U.S. military responded to disasters around the world. The Haiti example in 2010, the U.S., which is quite close to Haiti, was I think the first country on the ground, and they set up a command post and controlled the airport in Port-au-Prince to be able to get relief supplies in, and they had the most capacity, that was the closest, but some other groups complained that the U.S. was monopolizing access to the airport. So there's a lot of jockeying and coordination in these kind of complex emergencies relating to man-made or natural disasters. So I coded data myself on the disasters that the MDAT database include and compare that to the disasters that the U.S. government declared. The U.S. legally has like a process by which the ambassador in another country, the U.S. ambassador in another country, so I think Carolyn Kennedy was just appointed as a U.S. ambassador to Australia. So if Australia has another disaster, God forbid, if Carolyn Kennedy announces that the U.S. also declares that it is a disaster, that allows them 50 million US dollars, I think, immediate assistance, and the ability to also deploy other resources to provide assistance to the disaster. And I think it's really interesting to try to look at where the disasters were responding to. I showed you in the maps that earthquakes were relatively homogeneously distributed. Other kinds of disasters also can affect a wide number of regions. However, the U.S. That declared disasters and actually providing assistance are two different things. So you see a number of disasters that were declared in Africa, the most common in with 22, but only 2 of them led to the U.S. military actually providing assistance to. Contrast that with the Americas, closer to where the U.S. is. They declared and assisted with more disasters. Europe as well. And you can see the political involvement, like Oceania, the U.S. was also dramatically involved. And in the paper, I hypothesize about why the U.S., what strategies lead to the U.S. to respond to some areas' needs more quickly than others, as well as the different types of disasters that the U.S. was more likely to respond to. And the U.S. was more likely to declare floods than any other kind of disaster. Of course, they're also the most common as well. And I mentioned trying to think theoretically about why the U.S. would decide to intervene. And one thing was related to, humanitarian need would be an obvious example, but another would be, I know a couple of students in the class wrote on the democratic peace and the interconnectedness between different states that can be brought along by sharing a common political institutional structure, like both being a democracy, but then also trade was another example of something that encourages cooperation and decreased risk of conflict. So I looked bilaterally in how much the U.S. trades with these other countries, and I find quite a dramatic relationship between trade and the likelihood of a declaration of a disaster in a country. That as you trade more with a disaster, the U.S. is much more likely to declare a disaster and actually come to the assistance, which I think is really interesting, and it connects to how I can think about questions about how disasters happen in a way that's a little bit different than what we've seen so far this term, that it's international politics intervening in these kind of domestic civil conflict or human security challenges that hasn't been touched on that much. Anyway, side note on my own research. How can disasters affect conflict duration? This gets at the Eastin article again. Those explanations can be either state-focused or rebel-focused for the effects on conflict dynamics. The state-focused ones, it decreases state capacity to rebel groups, as I mentioned before. That can lead to conflict onset. It could also make it harder for the states to be able to stamp out any kind of opposition. So the military can be taken away from the battlefield, and then infrastructure damage due to floods. I just saw this amazing bridge got washed away in the Hunza Valley with the storm. One of the other videos that I didn't share, and a lot of people were critiquing the Chinese-built bridge is not being built very well, as it was washed away with the storms. But this infrastructure also hurts state capacity. It can make it hard to cross rivers. In the Karakoram Highway that goes all the way up from Pakistan up through China, there were a couple of places in which it was washed out, and people had kind of made ad hoc ways to cross or go around to another place that was safe to cross. But it really does show the ingenuity, but also the difficulty to provide or exert state capacity in areas that are really threatened by these kind of disasters. Turning to rebel-focused explanations for conflict duration, rebels can evade capture and avoid defeat more easily if the infrastructure is destroyed, or it's harder to reach certain parts of the country. It can affect the relative capability. If the state is weaker and the rebels stay the same, or potentially can get stronger by recruiting dissatisfied citizens to their cause, that could lead to a longer fight. And it can show that rebels can be competent in governing certain parts of the country. You do have a number of conflicts in which rebels can maintain governmental control over certain parts of the territory. If they can respond well, provide the needs for the citizens, that can show that they're competent and could lead to further support. Kind of similar to what we'll see with the video in Acch in the aftermath of the conflict, the efforts to try to provide support from both sides. Actually, let's go ahead and turn to that now. I have a couple of videos. One is relatively short, 9 minutes long. It's quite dated, and I get so used to watching 1080p or 4K videos, it's hard to remember how bad TV was with 480p was considered the best. But this is the best documentary that I found that really did show shortly after the natural disaster how it affected the fighting on the ground. So this documentary was in January of 2005. I mentioned that the earthquake happened in Boxing Day of 2004, so just a few weeks after the disaster. It really kind of shows the effect that it has on citizens as well as the rebels, and how they have real human feelings and difficulties in trying to organize and to wrap their head around their own suffering and their family suffering and people suffering in the region, and what effect it might have on their desire to lay down their arms. I also had a few other more recent videos talking about Acch as well. One looking 10 years after the end of the war. Spoiler alert, in 2005 there was a peace agreement less than 6 months after this initial video. The tsunami actually brought both sides to a peace agreement. 2015 video is the most recent one that I could find on the 10-year anniversary of the peace agreement, with the dissatisfaction that some people felt about the peace agreement and the risks of a conflict resurgence, which we haven't really talked about that much in this class, but is something that's really important to think about, because often conflicts do recur, especially within the first several years after the conflict ends, and then also connecting it to how often developing countries can be in need one year and then also can be in a position to help a next year. And so the Rohingya Muslim migration refugees over into Bangladesh, over 700,000 or in Bangladesh. Some of them have tried to take to the seas to try to reach other Muslim-oriented nations to start a new life, often Malaysia. But a number of these boats actually wash up because Acch is on the end of the western tip of Indonesia. You get some of these boats washing up there. And this video shows how the people there that have lived through a lot of these, the suffering and hardship that we've talked about this term, and try to pay it forward by trying to help other people. So try to end on a positive note with these videos. And that is just a couple of ways that the literature has talked theoretically about how disasters can lead to conflict or potentially to cooperation. Now we'll turn to the specific case study of Acch. So we have those other external videos, and come back and start talking about a couple of important points about the political history of the conflict and how the natural disaster shaped that relative capability between state and state rebels and non-state rebels.